Please call the meeting order. We on? Okay. Good evening, everyone. The time is now 5 p.m. I'd like to call this committee meeting of the Belton ISD School District Board of Trustees to order. A quorum of board members is not present. The first item on the agenda is public comments. And I believe that we have 6 people signed up, so let me read this additional information. In accordance with district policy, any person wishing to address the board committee during public comments must submit a public comments form. Those are the forms that I have here. Since committee meetings are special meetings of the board, public comments shall be limited to items on the agenda. Each participant shall be limited to 3 minutes in accordance with the board's operating procedures. Speaking to committee members in a disrespectful or threatening tone is unprofessional and counterproductive to a cause. We have a timer on the screen that shows your allotted time, and that sound will occur at the conclusion. The first person to speak is Margaret Hilton. Yes, ma'am, right here. When you start talking. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Margaret Hilton, and I live in Belton, Texas. I am a licensed school psychologist, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Texas, and I have worked and maintained those licenses for 33 years. I currently work for a telehealth company online, and I provide therapy for depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, panic episodes, attention deficit disorder, sexual abuse, and addictions. I'm here to share information to the committee that is important to consider in establishing a policy regarding sexually explicit books and the challenge process. Statistics from the YWCA in September of 2017 report that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys have been a victim of sexual abuse before age 18. The result of this type of victimization is years of emotional turmoil, including anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, panic episodes, and dissociative identity disorder. In a room with this many people, it's likely that over 5 have experienced sexual trauma. The requirement to read sexually explicit material exposes a person, a victim, to material that is a trigger for past abuse, resulting in flashbacks, panic, feelings of helplessness, anxiety, and depression. It would surprise me if the committee members were aware how emotionally traumatizing that is for victims. It is unnecessary to require other people to read sexually explicit material to convince the committee and the board that the books are harmful. Governor Abbott has found 850 books that are overtly sexual, and the list is sufficient for the board to eliminate them from the Belton School District circulation and prevent victims from being re-victimized. Your goal could be to help children who have been sexually abused know that they're not alone, and that's good. But please use therapeutic healing books like Why Me and Am I the Only One? Do not allow sexually explicit books to re-traumatize them and confuse them.
Thank you, ma'am. Next person is Brenda Howard.
Hello, Brenda Howard, Belton, Texas. I'm speaking to EF Local. This is EFA Local, and this is for instructional materials. It says, the ultimate authority for determining and approving the curriculum and instructional program of the district lies with the board. So if it's instructional material, it lies with the board. And then you go over to EFB local library materials, and it says, the superintendent shall ensure that librarians and other designated professional staff select library materials in accordance with the district policy and administrative regulations. The only reason I point this out is that it does not say that the school board is responsible for the library books. And even if this isn't in here, TEA says that yes, the school board is still responsible for the library books. So I like most of everything that's in here. On page 3 of 6 of EFB local, it does say, the district shall make every attempt to ensure at least one library material month is reviewed if applicable. So my concern there is, if there's 7 books, does that mean it takes 7 months or 9 months or whatever? So it just seems like that might be a challenge with regard to that. So what I want to also show is that there is EF legal. So now when you have EF legal, and this has been around since October 18th of 2021, and it says, students' First Amendment rights are implicated by the removal of books from shelves of the library. A district shall not remove materials from a library for the purpose of denying students access to ideas with the district disagrees. A district may remove materials because they are pervasively vulgar or based solely upon the educational suitability of the books in question. So this book is one that I can challenge now, and it's called Kiss Number 8. And on page 8, they're showing Jesus. He's up here on a cross, and it says, shame, you never get to see the back. Betcha Jesus has got an ass that could crack a walnut. Hell, I bet it could shell a cashew. Okay, this is on page 8, and I can assure you that this book is pervasively vulgar on all of these pages. It's a horrible, horrible book. It has zero educational value at all whatsoever. So I am requesting that the board call a special meeting to take the 7 books that we know violate the Texas Penal Code and actually vote that they are pervasively vulgar and can immediately be taken off the shelves. Thank you.
All right, next person is Hillary Hickland.
Hickland, Belton. Thank you so much for the chance to sit and talk and to feel like we're heard. I really appreciate it. As you develop the much needed policy for addressing sexually explicit and age-inappropriate books at the ISD schools, I would first like to thank you for taking action to address what we all agree is a very serious issue. I greatly appreciate the stated desire of the board to include parents in the process. However, this policy is reactionary, and it shifts the board's responsibility to the parents. It gives the impression that it's fear-based motivated. You're more afraid of being of litigation rather than protecting children. It's as though we're coming to you saying there are snakes in our school. And with this policy, your response is, well, we can't just go in and exterminate because not all snakes are venomous and some people might like snakes. So if you see any, or if your kid gets bit, then take pictures and file a report, and then we'll look into it. So here we are, busy parents of school-age children, saddled with the undue burden to find the books, read the books, file a formal challenge that includes page citations, and suggest an alternative book in place of the one that's challenged. What if we had this same undue burden for the books that come in to the district libraries? What literary value does each book have coming in, and how will this benefit our children? These are not my personal preferences. We are talking about clear violations of the Texas Penal Code. No policy is necessary for pervasively vulgar material. Let me just say that with every book I find, I have less confidence in the board's leadership and less trust that our schools are a safe place for our children. find more almost daily. It isn't 7 books in just one school. As of right now, in all of our secondary education libraries, I have 42 X-rated book reports to do. This is a very real warning. Parents like me will speak with our feet. Despite the influx in population growth in our area, public school enrollment is down, and we are evaluating our options. You know that sexually explicit and age-inappropriate books are in our libraries. A full audit is needed, and it's my recommendation that the board use the Krause list issued by Governor Abbott last November and investigated by Commissioner Morath as a starting point for a list of inappropriate and potentially harmful material, rather than put the onus on the parents to discover the sexually explicit and age-inappropriate material. I'm also aware that other districts who have adopted the same policy that you're proposing and looking at, they have also created a penal code committee, so that if there's any book that obviously violates this code of being pervasively vulgar or harmful to children, it's immediately removed from district circulation. Thanks for extra time.
Next, we have Janet Brown.
Janet Brown from Morgan's Point. There is a line in this new policy. We recognize the diversity of people in our community. Is this why people are required to read sexually explicit and pornographic material in order to submit a book review? Where are the school board and superintendent charged with protecting and having authority to remove these materials? Ephesians 5:11, take no part in the worthless deeds of evil and darkness, instead expose them. Decades of studies from respected academic institutions have demonstrated significant impacts of porn consumption on individuals, relationships, and society. These are some of the articles that have been published. Why porn can be difficult to quit, how porn can become an escalating behavior, how porn can affect the brain like a drug, how porn can change the brain, how porn can contribute to an unhealthy cycle of stress, how porn can negatively impact love and intimacy, how porn can hurt a consumer's partner, how porn can normalize sexual objectification, how porn can harm consumer sex lives, how porn can harm mental health and fuel loneliness, how porn can fuel sex trafficking, how the porn industry profits from non-consensual content and abuse, how porn can distort consumers' understanding of what normal sex is, how porn can promote sexual violence. Why is today's internet porn is unlike anything the world has ever seen. Consuming porn can lead to compulsive cravings and behavior due to the hijacking of dopamine, in some cases similar to those associated with substance abuse. Exposure to pornography at a young age may lead to poor mental health, sexism and objectification, sexual violence, and other adverse outcomes. Among other risks, when children view or read pornography, even once, that portrays abusive and misogynistic acts, they may view such behavior as normal and acceptable. Ultimately, the responsibility lies with the Belton ISD School Board and Superintendent. Actions speak louder than any eloquent written or spoken policy or word to pull out every piece of hidden, pervasively vulgar, and harmful material from the schools. My prayer is for the scales to be removed from eyes, ears open, and hearts softened to hear God's voice louder in this time of spiritual warfare. The battle for the hearts and minds of our children and families is here. It will take strong men and women of faith to stand up and do the right thing. They are counting on you to do the right thing. Will you? Thank you.
Next, we have Gregory Scott Daniel.
Good evening, Big Red Family. My name is Gregory Daniel. Talking to friends out of town about the value to this community. I describe Belton as the buckle of the Texas Bible Belt. There's a church on every corner, and some corners have two churches. It's something to be proud of. We have the oldest private college in Texas. It's a Christian school that puts on a passion play every spring that rivals the great passion play in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. There are 113 churches in BISD territory, 41,000 voters, and 28,000 taxpayers. The school's policy for vetting books requires the book must be read entirely, make notes of the illicit parts, file a report, and then a committee is formed to review the book. And maybe a decision will be made to take that book off the shelf permanently. Women for Belton's Christian community, who are taxpayers and informed voters, have stepped up to vet these books. Many of these ladies are putting down their devotional material that they would typically read and spending their time, their private time, reading these older books. Imagine if the Grand Avenue Theater used this process. It would be chaos. And you know, parents eventually would no longer drop off their kids to see a movie anymore. This policy is a bureaucratic process to allow some books to slip through. It's an offensive burden to place on well-intentioned, good people with a moral conscience. This policy, thankfully, mentions that books will reflect the diversity of our community. However, this policy fails to affirm that books normalizing pedophilia, incest, pornography, and other illegal activities are not included in that diversity. Last week, I watched a video of BISD trustee, and at the end I heard him say, I have a child in BISD, and I don't want anyone telling him what to read or not read. Now I'll do the same for your child. This individual's not here tonight, but if he was, I would say, Mr. President, live and let live is not a Christian philosophy. The Christians in this community live by the law of love. Love seeks the highest good of others, even its enemies. Although this policy embraces what you call a reflection of Belton's diverse values, it misses the mark on this great law of Christianity, the law of love. I ask that you adopt a policy that clearly and firmly states that the books normalizing illegal and disgusting acts of pedophilia, incest, pornography, rape, violence, and other illegal activities not be on the shelves of Belton libraries.
No one else has signed up for public comments, so we'll move down the agenda. Item 3, Matt.
So, Board of Trustees, thanks for your time here tonight. We appreciate the Policy Committee being here. We're going to start off with CDA Local. Melissa's going to come on up and tell you a little bit about CDA Local and what's changing in there. I also want to make note that you see all the maroon shirts around today. Just to be clear about the maroon shirts, is Uvalde starts their first day of school after a tragedy last spring. Many districts around the state wore maroon today, and so you see a lot of maroon in our solidarity to support Uvalde and their challenges as they open up the school. Turn it over to Melissa.
Okay. So we're here to review investment policy, CDA local, and this is basically our investment policy. That kind of keeps us in compliance with the Public Funds Investment Act. So it's the board's responsibility to review this policy annually and then put that in writing through a resolution. So DASB basically gave us revisions to the local policy, and they really weren't that significant. The only changes that they made were just a reference to the policy BDAE that basically addresses the collateralization of bank deposits that exceed the FDIC insurance coverage. So at any point in time, any cash we have on deposit at the bank has to be collateralized to insure those deposits, safeguard taxpayer money. It's basically, it's just a reference to that policy, and then makes clarification that the board reviews and not necessarily adopt the investment policy. However, there is a signed resolution that kind of basically puts it in writing that you have reviewed the investment policy and strategies, and then if there were any changes that were made. So basically, that's what this is, the first read of that investment policy. Basically, the same policy you've been seeing from year to year. All of it conforms with, again, the Public Funds Investment Act. And of course, as you read through the policy, primary goal of our investment policy and our strategies is basically preservation of capital, which is safety, and then liquidity to make sure we have enough cash on hand to meet our cash flow needs. And of course, return on investment is, that's part of that. And so, as you read throughout, we're basically not obligating funds for a long term. And we'll have significant cash in that bond fund, and then we can kind of layer those investments so that the maturities come in or whatever those needs to the bond payments. Any questions?
I guess the only two changes were like minute, but there's nothing substance-wise.
Nothing substance,
I
right?
mean, we still have to review it and adopt it by resolution as opposed to adopting every year, right? That's all we're doing.
Yes, sir.
Same effect.
Same effect.
Chrissy, you have any questions? Thank you, ma'am.
All right.
Next one is EF Local, Instructional Resources. Deanna's going to come up and walk you through this, and she'll explain a little bit about our current policy, EF Local, and the proposal to split that in.
So tonight, we are bringing forward for first reading different EFB and EFA. So currently, we have EF Local. It has been a singular policy addressing instructional materials to include library materials. We've been studying this policy for a while, and so one of the decisions we discussed was to separate them out. And so proposal tonight is to show you two policies. The first one is EFB, library materials. That one, so I just want to start with that. And I'm just going to point out some key things as we've studied and talked through this policy, what's in the current policy proposal. First off, I want to admit two clarifications that will need to be fixed in moving forward with the second reading, and that is that everywhere digital media specialists are referenced, they'll be digital information specialists. So there's a clarification on that, and then there's just, it was brought to my attention, some of the headings missed a B or an A, so we'll make sure those are fixed as well. In talking the first page of EFB Local, I want to point out in the first section, or in the section regarding parent involvement, we wanted to ensure that we specifically have addressed transparency with parents when meeting their child's needs, and so this allows for them to have access to public review of titles and how those materials are accessed, and so that is our catalogs. Our library catalogs, as you know, are online, and parents will be able to access those. There's a specific section in this policy addressing the penal code, and committees, as we start to talk about our exhibits, the committees will specifically be looking at material in reference to penal codes. The next section in EFP Local is around the selection of materials, and this section is critical because when the committee that reviews uses their checklist, they will be referencing the selection criteria, and so we have addressed in this the ones that they're standard in terms of ensuring support of the curriculum, balanced collection. I do want to point out that two of the criteria reference, one references favorable professional library reviews, the other recognizes state or national awards. And as we develop internal regulations for those, we will be spelling out which of those awards we're looking for. So I think a common one, for example, would be Texas Blue Bonnet Awards. That's a very standard recognition, and the state has those recognitions out there. In addition, we added to this from the TASB policy Again, another reference to the penal code, so you're looking at it specifically as the materials is selected.
Is that number 11? Remember that?
That is correct, it's 11.
That was also referenced by the TEA in their
By
letter.
TEA
Yeah,
as
back
well.
in April.
Yes,
Can I go back to the?
absolutely,
selections based on the list?
absolutely.
So where will we specify those lists? Is that in the administrative?
And we'll
regulations?
have some administrative regulations just for how the policy is, how the committees are selected. So this gives that high overall view, but when we put it into practice. In terms of, then we have a second section addressing parents. This one is parent consideration, and this, the highlight of this is that the ultimate determination for what, for the appropriateness of what a child reads remains with the student and the parent. And so when we think about all of our families and their varying values, beliefs, and what's important to them and what their child reads, this is specifically addressing that. While we'll have librarians that are in our libraries, they may assist a child in selecting a book. Ultimately, the decision lies with the parent, whether they want their child to read that or not. And this, up until this line, it's really talking about what a parent wants for their child. When you get to challenged resources, that is when a parent is starting to question, or a community member, whether or not any student should read that book. The first piece of this section in challenged resources talks about who can challenge a resource. So our policy reads that a parent, a student over the age of 18, an individual employee, or any district resident who is 18 years or older may challenge a material that's in a district library program. And I know we talked a lot about that through our time. In addition, it says that the number of library materials in review will be in balance with the resources available. So our goal is going to be to review books as they come in with a commitment to at least one. We know we've got to pull committee members together. We are asking teachers and parents and principals, administrators to read those books. And so we'll do our best to work through those books with at least one done per month. If applicable, meaning if there's not any books, then we wouldn't have any that month to read. And then we do specify that challenges will be priority will be given to challenges by parents, and we talk through a parent and what they're wanting, children to read, and they have children in our system. We have guiding principles in reference to challenge resources. One is just a principle that a complaint can be made, so you can file an objection even though the material was put in there on the basis that there was a selection process for it. A complaint can still be made. It is the parent's ability to exercise control over their child, so that's like second or third time we mentioned that parents have that right. And then we will not restrict access to the material in the process, and that's alignment with EF legal, except if the material is alleged to have content which is harmful or obscene in nature and a reasonable determination was made to restrict access to material to a student without parent permission, or if the copies of the book are needed. So what we're saying here is, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, how we're gonna get to that determination. But if a reasonable determination was made, then until it completes the process, it'll be restricted to require parent permission. And then the major criteria of this will be based on appropriateness for its intended use. So that's the guiding principles. The first piece in this is an informal reconsideration, and the informal reconsideration process will be the process used for anyone that makes a challenge. So whether that's a parent, an employee, a community member, we're going to first go through the informal process, which is where someone will sit down with them, a librarian or administrator, and talk about the process for that book, why it was selected, the criteria that was used, and the purpose of it. ability for a child to choose or a parent to choose whether or not they want their child to read that book. Number 3 is specific to if the complaint is a concerned parent, because we always want to make sure that parent is aware that they could choose alternative material. So they could say, you know what, I just don't want my child to ever read this book. If we're unable to resolve the issue at the informal level, then it will go to the formal process. And the formal process will be where a form is submitted. I am the recipient of those forms, and those forms will follow what we have outlined in EFB Exhibit A, and I'll walk through that in a few minutes. And that it'll be placed in a committee review for the committee to review in its entirety. If in the process the complainant alleges the book is in violation of the penal code, there will be a committee of 3 that will review the form the complainant sent and determine from that, because they won't read it in entirety. It's not going to bypass the formal process, but they will specifically look at that content to make a reasonable determination as to whether or not the book should be pulled out of access without parent permission. From there, the book goes into a formal process. We've talked a lot about this, and in just this paragraph talks about that we'll have a 5-member minimum that will include a principal or a campus administrator, a librarian or digital information specialist, a teacher, and a parent. And we do have, we talked about that'll be randomized. Our regulation will outline specifically that process, and our parents have been our volunteers that when we've sent out several communications now for parents to select if they'd like to be a part of a review committee. All members will read the book in its entirety to make a decision, and the committee shall weigh the strengths and weaknesses of it as a whole. The exception to this, and it'll be addressed in the form for the committee to review, is in relation to graphics and illustrations, which must independently not violate the code. So the code states that things are reviewed in their entirety or as a whole. We have in this policy with the exception of pictures or illustrations, and then those need to be independently weighed against the policy, against the penal code. There'll be 5 members on the team minimum, a majority vote on the on what should happen. So if in the form, and we'll look at that in a minute, it makes a recommendation, and they will use that form, Exhibit B. We'll go through that to address the to prepare their written report and everything that they'll be reviewing. In the event that we receive multiple forms for a single material, the first form that is received will be the one that initiates the process and starts that challenge process. After material has been reviewed through the committee, it shall not be reviewed again for a period of no less than 5 years. If there is an appeal, so if the complainant is not satisfied with the result from the committee and they start an appeal, we wanted to be clear that that process will start at level 2 with the district administrator following our formal grievances. So we didn't want there to be any question at that time of whether it starts at a level 1 or a level 2. The next section talks about gifts and donations, and again, any material or money that's must follow the selection process before it would be placed in the library. And then we have just a regular maintenance of library materials, and that's just a standard process for how typically librarians will every year look at their collections, see what books they've lost, what books need to be replaced, if there's books that need to be removed because of age, and so we'll have some standard just processes for maintenance. There are 2 policies that specifically, there's 2 exhibits that align with this that we mentioned. Exhibit A will be the form that is the complainant files. It asks standard information I do want to put out that we do ask that the complainant file or read the book in its entirety. This is because they are requesting that the book be removed from access for all students, not just for their own child. And then the key question in this is question number 3, which specifically addresses to what material do you object, and we ask that you be specific and cite pages and quote exact passages. So the committee has a responsibility to make a decision on this material, and so it's very key that they understand what the person objecting to is objecting to and why. And then we ask what grade levels, recommendation or none, and what the complainant is asking be done with the book, whether it's being removed from the library, moved to a different grade level, or not have their child have access to it. If that's the case, we could have completed that in the formal, but we wanted to make sure. Specifically, in order to address we ask that the complainant make a reference to, are they asking for this, do they consider this material to be in violation of the penal code? The language that's in here is directly from the penal code, so that they don't have to go back and look that up or see what it says. It's specific for that. We ask that they, again, state specifically what is violating the penal code. So the question is different from 3. 3 is the book as a whole. You may not feel it's appropriate, but is there anything specific in the book that you're claiming or violates the penal code? That will be used by that 3-person committee to specifically review to make a decision if it should stay. It should be more restrictive than EF legal.
If it would stay on the shelf.
If it would stay on the shelf for anyone to access, or if it will require parent permission. So while we're in a process of, as we speak, while we're in the process of reviewing books, there are parents who are saying they would like their child to read that material. So they would have the option to say that. And then Exhibit B is the form that the committee uses to make the decision. The form is a process. I want to just be clear because I was asked a question about it. This is the overall form that will guide the final report. So it's not something each committee member fills out, but they do have to answer each question individually themselves and then come to consensus as a committee. They're to focus on all selection criteria, so questions around appropriateness, questions specifically on, in addition to all selection criteria, again, are the images free from the penal code, because we said specific images, so they have to look at those as well. And then is the content, so they'll be looking at 2 different things in reference to the penal code.
What page are you on?
I'm on page 18, and then they'll look at reviews, specific reviews. So just because somebody on Amazon likes a book, that's not a specific review. We have specific reviewers that they will look at.
This was Exhibit D.
And I apologize for that. It should be Exhibit B.
Okay.
And I apologize. We
Yeah,
had the policies together and then the exhibits together, and so I had A, B, C, and D, and then decided, you know what, for clarity purposes, we should have exhibits that go with EFB and exhibits that go with EFA. So I apologize, that will be fixed. And then the committee at the end, there'll be one report. All committee members will sign that report, and then the signature of the chairperson. And that is EFB. Do you have any questions or comments on B, or do you want me to go through A?
So far, you have already collected a large number of volunteers who are willing and able to serve on these committees if asked.
Yes, from parents. We had about 130 last time I checked across the system, and we've sent that letter out twice. I'll also send that form to anyone if they specifically emailed me, or then I would make sure people knew how their avenue. Most that were already on the list.
Shall we discuss this one first, and then go to the next one? I may have to ask Holly.
Yeah, she's ready, right here.
Oh, okay. I need to ask Holly something. Well, first of all, you guys want to do it that way? Are you okay with that, or should we go through the whole thing first?
That's fine. However you want to.
Okay, Matt, what do you think?
I'm good with you. Talking about this one first.
Let's talk about this one, okay. All right. Let me go back here to the end. I have a question about the situation where we actually got a committee of 3, right, which is kind of a pre-review, right, before it goes to committee of 5. So someone has had essentially, let's just say they've had an informal conference, and now they're doing a reconsideration. However, if there are certain allegations made, then the committee of 3 can review it, right?
Can pull it out of access until it goes through the process.
Right.
So when you look at EF legal, it talks about, while it's in a process, there's no recourse for immediate pull. And so this would allow that specifically when you're looking at passages or graphics that the complainant is saying are in violation of penal code.
So EF legal, which I have here, talks about the First Amendment. Holly, how is it that the First Amendment doesn't come into play if we got a committee of 3 and we pull it because of certain allegations? How does that?
Well, obscenity is not protected by
Right.
the First Amendment.
Right.
So if the group looks at it and determines that it's obscene, and you still have a process that it goes through, and they're applying the provisions in the penal code. The other trigger would be if it contains harmful material. And again, if based on, reasonable review, if people determine, hey, this might contain harmful material, be a violation of the penal code, then we have the authority to do that. The First Amendment doesn't say you have to keep all materials.
Right. So could we say in that part of the policy, could we say that if the material is harmful as defined in the penal code, if it's obscene, because there's 2 provisions that we're talking about here in the penal code, and number 3, using EF local, I don't know where this language came from. They cite Board of Education versus PICO. It's a 1982 U.S. Supreme Court decision. Could we also add to that pervasively vulgar?
We could. One thing that you have to remember about the PICO decision is that it was not a majority decision, it was a plurality decision. And it established, or the court recognized for the first time this concept of the right to read. And so it's not quite as strong of an opinion as perhaps it might have been when the structure of the Supreme Court was different. So they found an implied right in the First Amendment, the right to read. So it's kind of an interesting history. Not a majority decision, not a clear majority.
Hasn't been challenged obviously since then, right?
The Supreme Court has really looked at it in terms of school, library, book challenges, right?
Okay.
Now, the PICO decision has been used as guidance by both the 5th Circuit and I believe it's the 11th Circuit. They've relied on it. They're recognizing it's a plurality decision, so it doesn't have, it's not binding precedent, but they have relied on it and use that as the factors to consider.
So just for everyone to understand, what you mean by plurality means that if it was unanimous, then all 9 justices, right?
Right.
Okay. Now, if it's plurality, tell us what that means.
It's basically, you didn't have a majority. You didn't have a clear majority that agreed on the reasoning behind the decision. So plurality decisions are relied on only for, if there's a point in the decision that a majority agreed upon, but they didn't agree on the rest of the language or the rest of the decision, then circuit courts of appeal will rely on it for that part, but maybe not the rest of it. They're not bound by it.
Okay. So for purposes of the public, of course, we're in the 5th Circuit.
Right.
Now, did you say that the 5th Circuit has followed the PICO decision or has not?
They recognized that it was not binding precedent, but they did apply the analysis in a subsequent decision.
And,
Yeah, they have relied on it.
and that decision, they didn't go against the PICO decision.
It didn't, they, I don't wanna say took it to task, but they did recognize that it's not a plurality decision.
So
Um,
the point of all this discussion is that, you know, the things that we're faced against is not only trying to balance the interests of our district and the values and beliefs of our district, but we also have to look at, I mean, the law can be a significant impediment to drafting these policies, can it not?
It can, and, you know, First Amendment cases are very fact-specific, right? So, the facts and, a governing body's reasoning for removing a book is very important. They will look at, you know, what were the influences on the board or the city council, if it's a public library. They'll say, you know, who showed up at public comment to speak, you know, did that, influence, you know, the board members, or did they state what the reasoning was? Most of the time, when a book is removed and that removal is challenged, the reason that schools lose, and again, there's not a ton of cases in this area, but in the cases where school districts have lost, it's because the school board didn't articulate why they removed it. So you have to have a basis. And what's really clear from all of the Supreme Court precedent and other cases where they look at book challenges is that you have to have a critical, thoughtful process for reviewing books, which is, you know, what we're trying to accomplish with this.
Right, which is when we started talking about this, and we know that we were trying to meet that objective with a clear, thoughtful process in place, so that we don't get in a situation where if we are challenged, okay, we have a much better chance of winning. Correct?
Right.
Okay. So by putting these things in here, we're giving our district a basis for removing books, and we have a sound basis for that, right?
Right.
Okay.
Also, you're trying to balance the First Amendment with requirements under our state penal code, criminal law.
Right.
There is a balancing act
Okay.
with that.
All right. Chris, you have any questions about that?
Well, yeah, so you wanted to add sort of a third statement there. What was it that you wanted to add?
Well, it's from EF local. There's just a, legal. Yeah, legal.
Pervasively vulgar language,
Yeah.
right.
Can you pull it up on your?
I've got it.
Okay, it's EF legal. If you look at removal of library materials, and Deanna did put a reference to EF legal in there. And she mentioned it a couple times during the presentation. It says students' First Amendment rights are implicated by the removal of books from the shelves of the school library. A district may remove materials because they are pervasively vulgar. So
you want to just add a reference to EF?
Yes.
Or?
Yeah, well, I mean, we can add a reference to, or just use that language, just that phrase. In other words, we would have three bases for challenging things. It'd be Penal Code 1, Penal Code 2. One is harmful materials, Penal Code. The other one is obscene materials, Penal Code. And number 3, just the language of pervasively vulgar.
So on page 11, in the first paragraph, we would say if the formal objection to library material includes an allegation, library material includes content, graphics, or illustrations considered harmful material as defined by the first penal code, or obscene as defined by the second penal code, or pervasively vulgar.
As stated in the EF local.
Or pervasively.
Now, Holly, does that come from that PICO decision, that
I was
language?
just looking at, the origination of the phrase pervasively vulgar, and I'm not sure which case that originally came from. It may be the
I mean, it's a fairly significant burden just listening, I mean, just read the phrase pervasively.
Right, I think it is from the PICO decision.
I mean, so if there's one sentence that's vulgar, that doesn't mean it's pervasively vulgar all throughout, right?
Pervasive.
Yeah, yeah.
So if that's, we add it there, then my recommendation would be to go to the form that the complainant fills out and add it there as well. So
Right.
that they're also have the option to say it's harmful or obscene or pervasively vulgar as described above. And then I would wonder, so for the two penal codes, we put definitions, do we need the definitions?
Well, see, that's the problem, is there something that,
I'm sorry.
That we can cite to, right, right.
I'm sorry?
That's something we can cite to for the
Right,
pervasively
yeah.
vulgar, right? We can cite to the PICO decision. I will need to verify that that is where that phrase originated, because I'd like to use the first Supreme Court case and rely on that, but it may be the PICO
well,
decision.
the thing about it, this is the way I was looking at it. If you look at our policy and then we make reference to EF local, if we make reference to it, then how is it coming into play here?
If legal.
EF legal, keep saying local, EF legal, okay? And then the other reason that, that's important is because students do have a First Amendment right. I mean, we have to understand that. I mean, whether you disagree with it or agree with it, it's still there, okay? And as you were saying, I mean, we have kids from all walks of life, obviously, that, what one person may disagree with, another person says, I want my kid to read that, right? Yeah.
So the Fifth Circuit case where they used the PICO analysis was Campbell versus the St. Tammany Parish School Board. It was a Fifth Circuit decision from 1993. And in that case, they were looking at removal of a book about voodoo. It's called Hoodoo and Voodoo. And they ultimately removed it, but they didn't really have, I don't believe, if I recall this correctly.
Well, the other
didn't say
thing,
really good basis.
Holly, the other concern, I wanted to bring up this point, but the other concern I have is that if there's no definition of that somewhere, where the complainant can actually look at it, what does that mean? Because what it means to one person.
Right.
So since it's a legal policy, then we need to have the courts define that, or if it's defined in some sort of statute, I don't know. So, at the same time, though, we don't want to complicate things by adding that in there.
Yeah, I don't wanna add it if we can't point to a definition.
Right, that's my point.
Yeah. Because I think, looking at the penal code, right, the penal code does a pretty good job of defining,
Of course.
right? We're talking about patently offensive, there's a definition, there's a,
Sure.
right, kind of going through all of those, so.
Right.
I think there's a lot of definitional support just with those two.
And the reason I approach my question that way is because of that point, that if it's not defined,
Right.
then I don't wanna address it. I don't wanna put it in there if it's not defined by, if there isn't one, then.
It's not, I think you're going to have to look at a handful of different decisions and try to extrapolate
Yeah.
a
But
definition.
then we're trying to interpret what it actually means.
Right, and we're trying to set boundaries
Right.
on it, and it's gonna be hard,
Okay.
but, I don't mind looking into it.
Well, I just wanted to make sure that as a committee, that we actually looked at that issue and then made a sound decision as to why we didn't include that in there. And I agree with you, Chris. If it's not defined, I know what it means in my own mind, but because it is a legal policy, what does it mean legally? I don't know. Janet, any thoughts on that?
I'm with Chris, I think the penal code is pretty clear.
Okay.
I think any committee reading that would be able to make
Okay,
a
all right.
decision based on what the penal code says.
Right.
If I find a definition of pervasively vulgar, I will bring it to you.
Right. If not, then we won't go there. Okay, all right. So that, as we were talking about the process, so we go, if it's one of those, if it's obscene as defined in the penal code, or if it's, what's the other, the harmful material is defined. If it violates one of those two, then it can go to the committee of three, and the committee of three can decide if they're gonna pull it immediately.
So they're not gonna pull the book immediately.
Right.
Still goes through a process, the way it's written, we can.
Right, still goes through the process.
Still goes through a process.
Access will be
All
temporarily removed.
those three are doing is saying, there is someone who is alleged that this is in violation. They've given specific sides to it, and these three people have to look at that and say, is that enough to make a reasonable decision that we will limit the access of the book until it can go through a committee?
So temporary inaccessibility until it's either
Without-
removed or
Right.
remains.
Now, it's still available,
Right.
and so if a parent says, I don't want you pulling that for my kid. My kid wants to check that out, then they would be allowed. It's not gonna pull it until it's gone through.
So it's sort of the reversal, okay? If a parent still wants it, they need to say, oh, no, I don't want that. I want my child to have access for that. They can still have access to
They
that.
can still have access to that book.
But at the same time, though, we remove accessibility to the
To the rest.
remainder.
Correct.
I like that process. When I, when we talked about it before, and I think that's that eliminates a lot of issues for us.
Okay, there have been a couple of districts that have defined pervasively vulgar as lewd or profane.
I don't want to cite another district, right? I want to cite somebody.
It needs to come from a,
Lewd or profane, and
Right.
well, lewd and profane comes from the Bethel versus Fraser decision. You know, but that involved speech, on-campus speech. But limited.
yeah, so if it's not defined anywhere, then, I mean, obviously, the two penal code, obviously, that's statutory, it comes from, but if the Supreme Court hasn't said, okay, this is how that's defined, then I think we eliminate that issue. Okay?
And just so we're clear on that, yeah, so we have, and that committee that's looking at it, and then our committee, the penal code says harmful as taken as a whole. And, same with the obscene as taken as a whole, and we are making the exception that graphics and illustrations will be looked at independent.
Right. I like that too. Chris, Janet?
Yeah, as a whole is important, right? I mean, and that comes from the penal code, right, as well. And, you know, I know there's some concerns about the length of the process, right, or what the process has to include, right? But it says the body, or like the material as a whole. How can you judge material as a whole if you do not read the material as a whole, right? Like you can't check that box, right, if you don't do it, right? And so the other piece of it, right, is the documentation piece of it, right? And we talked about this a little bit earlier. Like what we're trying to do is put something in place that's defensible, right? Like we're going to take material, we're going to put it through the process. If the committee says, hey, look, this is not appropriate, and we want to remove this thing, we want to make sure that that removal stands, right? I mean, that's what that process is about. And so, again, I don't think we're forcing anybody other than the assistant superintendent for curriculum to read the material, right? I mean, the rest, we've got a body of volunteers who have signed up to participate in the process. So we are not forcing anybody to do this.
We are randomly selecting our principals and our teachers.
Okay, so
Our parents are volunteers.
So, does somebody have the ability to opt out if selected?
Yes, we will put that in.
Okay.
The teacher does not want to read that book.
I mean, the process has to be robust, so that if the material comes out, when a material comes out, it comes out and stays.
The process has to pass the test.
Right.
If you got a weak process, then it may not withstand scrutiny later on.
All right.
Okay, so we move to EFA.
On your exhibit,
Yes.
you know, let's see where I make that note. Okay, like, for example, look at page 15.
Okay.
See, my note to myself was attach additional sheets if necessary to complete this process. And folks need to know that if you fail to specify, then what happens in that regard? If someone fails to specify?
It doesn't provide the explicit guidance to the committee to draw attention to what the person was concerned with. So if you just read a book and say sexual content inappropriate, and that's all you say, it doesn't give specific examples. When the committee goes back to review, it says, well, this what was your concern in this? Because we know everyone has varying, I mean, we're talking about for any book that could be reconsidered.
So should we specify it here, because it's right in front of you, that if you're not specific enough, then that could result in the,
So what it says is an incomplete form will be returned for completion. So if you don't give any specificity, I'm gonna want to send that back to that complaint and just say, we need more specific. I really want you to provide more specific information for the committee to review.
do they stay in line, or do they go to the back of, how we're gonna do
Until it's
that?
completely done, it's not submitted. Like it's not.
It's not sent to a committee until it's.
Okay, okay, all right, well, that takes care of that. Okay,
On the form, sorry, I started talking about the form, on page 18, hold on, sorry, this is EFD exhibit.
Yes.
Yeah. So where it says recommendations, I just want to tweak the wording on this a little bit.
Okay.
So it starts with recommendations. It looks like that S is struck through. So recommendation by review committee, and then strike member,
Okay.
right? Because this is a committee form, right?
Yes, and I will make that same note on EFA
Yeah.
as well.
so the S has been,
Yeah, the S is struck through.
Struck, right,
It
yeah.
looks, it's hard to see, but
yeah,
yeah,
So we'll just by review committee.
right. Yeah, recommendations by review
Excellent.
committee for treatment. Yeah. Now,
EFA is specific to instructional materials. Again, the selection process for this is narrowed down to be this, which is very similar to what was in EF local before. Right, yes, before. I do want to point out that in this, administrators, teachers, other district personnel, parents, residents, and community members may make recommendations for instructional materials or selections. And we address gifts of instructional materials shall be evaluated according to criteria in this policy. In EFB, gifts and was a separate section. And here it's been combined with that because these go through, it's a different process. The challenge resources is the same in terms of who can challenge an instructional material. It's the same as who can challenge a library book, and it's the same process with the number. Will be reviewed and balanced with resources and at least one per month. Sometimes instructional materials can take longer depending on what it is, what all is involved in that resource. Same as EFB in terms of the guiding principles, the difference being that access to a challenge material shall not be restricted except for the child for which the parent is complaining. And so if you don't, we can always make an adjustment for, let's say it's a math book and you're objecting to math curriculum. We are not going to limit access for everyone, but we can look at specifically for that child. And then, again, the process is very similar to the informal reconsideration. It's the same. The difference here is just the principal or designee librarian has been removed from the informal and from the formal. Otherwise, the process is the same. 5 members minimum, principal, teacher, parent. And again, we would use the same volunteer parent list. Materials read in its entirety and is weigh the strengths and weaknesses as a whole. Similar, again, they'll take a vote. They'll use this form for this one, which is Exhibit B, for the committee to review. In terms of frequency of review, this is it will be if it was a state adoption, then it will not be reviewed again until it is evaluated in the next state adoption process. And so there are some materials that do go through a state adoption process. There are other materials that do not. And when it's not a part of the state adoption, then it will be reviewed in a period of no less than 5 years. And again, the appeal for this is at a level 2. Following very similar to EFB, EFA, the Exhibit A under this policy is the form that the complainant fills out. Again, it's very similar. Also, again, citing the specific pages as we discussed, and then I'll make the change in reference to, oh, that's on this one. And then what is their recommendation? Exhibit B, we really narrowed it to purpose and appropriateness of the material. We did add in this one, what is the overall purpose of the material and is that purpose accomplished? Because in an instructional material, we felt like, unlike a library book, you're not going to talk, the purpose kids are self-selecting the books, but in instructional material, why are we using this specific resource and what are we trying to teach? That's where they would bring in what teach references. And then I'll make the adjustment here. They look at content, review, formal reviews, and then I'll make the adjustment for committee. They'll be looking at it as a whole, signature of the review committee, and then signature of the chairperson. So following very similar to EFB, just for instructional materials.
Yeah, clarification on this one, the difference between EFA and EFB is really when we're talking difference between instructional materials and library materials. The instructional materials are part of required curriculum in the classroom.
Correct.
Library materials are optional for checkout from school.
Correct.
Is that the distinguishing
That's
factor
the
between the
distinction
two?
why I think it needed to be two separate, because it's two different purposes.
And they arrive on the shelves, well, in the school in two different ways, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can we digress for just a moment? We go to page 12 on the appeal.
Yes.
And I'm only asking this question because there's reference made to DGBA, FNG, and GF.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, DGBA is the grievance, FNG is the parent complaints and grievance, and then GF is the public complaints. When you say it starts at a level 2, it starts and ends at a level 2.
It doesn't start and end. I mean, our policies for grievances, our appeals are three levels.
Right.
The first level is at the lowest level, and so what we wanted to be clear about is that the book or the instructional material going through a formal reconsideration process and a decision being made would serve as the level 1 requirement, so that the appeal from the complainant would go to immediately to a level 2, and they wouldn't start over or feel like they're starting over at a level 1. And so that was to be very clear with everyone, but that's where the appeal process starts, is at a level 2.
Okay.
So it's gone, so technically the complainant had an informal process, they met with someone. They had a formal process, the material went through a committee, assuming the conclusion they were seeking was they're not satisfied with that, they would start at level 2 and not repeat at a level 1.
Okay, and ultimately ends at a level 3.
Correct.
Okay. Good work.
I know this has been complicated, and I know it's taken a lot of thought and care and time and consultation with legal facts. I know that it's not everybody's favorite thing to discuss, and I know that we're doing this in a time when things are really complicated in our world. We are all parents. We are all advocates of the children in this district, and we want what is best for them. We would not do this without care, but we're going to do what's best for them. And I appreciate you, Deanna, for everything you've done.
So we'll make just some grammatical revisions, and we'll take it to. Is there any other questions or comments?
I want to reiterate what Chris has said, and I can't stress it enough, that the process needs to be strong. And that's one of the reasons that it's taken such a long time. And when you have a strong process and you have a much better chance of surviving a challenge, then why wouldn't we do that? I mean, we owe it to our district to do that. Because all I know is that you get into a litigation, that is a tremendous mess of everything. not only for, putting stress on folks, but also the cost associated with that, right? Okay. And Deanna, thanks for hanging in there. I know it's been difficult. You've done a great job. And then Matt, thanks for your weighing in on things, and thanks for your leadership. I know it's been a difficult thing, and it's been difficult for everybody. This has been weighing heavy on me too. Something that you think about keeps you up at night, and you want to do the right thing. Chris, anything else you want to share with us?
I mean, I can't say it any better as far as thanks goes. I know we talked about this being a long process, but there's been a reconsideration process on the books for over 30 years in this district, right? And so this isn't a brand new process,
No.
right? So this is an enhancement to a process that has existed for that long. And so I think really when some of this came up relatively recently, right, and taking materials through the process, I think the finding was it was a weak process, one that wouldn't stand up. We needed which really spurned sort of our study, your study and guidance, right? For this process, right? And what made it so tough is, right, TEA came out with, stuck their nose in the policy business, right, which they don't normally do. TEA came up with a model policy which set out a framework for all this, right? It was actually, so there were some really great framework things, but from an implementation standpoint, were really unachievable, right? You couldn't do it. And we would have to double the staff of Belton ISD, right, in order to execute, sort of their model process. And so we were able to take sort of the good things from that and think about it for a meeting or two. And then we got the TASB process, right, which I think answered some of those questions, right, and then gave us a couple more questions to ask ourselves and figure out how we want to go through it, to take a meeting or two and then get to this point, to where we can really put a process forward, where we can really put some enhancements to the process forward, right, that really do make this hopefully stand up, right, when there's materials that shouldn't be here, we don't want it to be here, we want to make sure that that process is solid.
The last thing we would want is to say, this doesn't belong here, and then somebody comes in and says, you didn't have a good process for this, you don't have a good reason for this.
There's two sides to
It's going
this.
back on the shelf and it's going back on.
Yeah, and I want to make sure if it comes out, it stays in, right? So that's what this has all been about. Like I know we talk about this being a long process, but we've had a process, right? This is an enhancement that I think is long overdue.
But going back, in November, Governor Abbott writes to the commissioner, I think it was in November, early part of November. And then the commissioner sends his letter in April, I believe. I think that was the timeline, when they came out with this model policy. And then when did TASB come out with its policy? Was it June maybe, or May?
End of May, I think.
End of May. So, and then here we are, September, so, it's been a long process, but at the same time though, they took a long time as well to give us some guidance.
I know there's people who have been involved in this that aren't in this room, right, to help get here, right, the team underneath, so please express, our thanks.
Yeah, I'd like to thank him personally,
Yeah.
it's, because it's certainly been a team effort. And Dan, I can't thank you enough for staying with this thing.
It's challenging.
It's challenging. You've had big, with our grading policy, which, you just implemented this year, and then another big one, so, great job with that.
Somebody else's turn.
Yeah. So,
Point taken.
okay.
Mike?
That's why we have a policy committee, right?
I think it's work, it's been a lot of work, and a lot of understanding to represent each and every person in our system, and that's a challenge.
Yeah.
That's of course.
Right, okay. And Chris, thank you, and Janet, thank you for everything that you've done, and, when you guys speak, I certainly listen, and I always want to hear what you guys have to say, because it's important.
Thanks for leading us.
Yeah. So, man, anything else we need to discuss about this
No,
policy?
y'all hit the timeline pieces. When I was reflecting on things, it was February and a workshop for the entire board that we talked to y'all about potential next steps for the spring, even though we didn't have any guidance at that point. And since that time, here's where we landed, and I'm pretty proud of where we landed so far. Doesn't mean that things are perfect, but I think Deanna just said it well. When you think about 13,000 plus students in the school district and everybody involved in that, I think the policy committee has developed a draft policy that is thoughtful and defensible and addresses the things that you all have set out for us to address. So role of the board is in the policy world, and I appreciate that immensely because y'all did a lot of tough work on this.
All right, nothing else on this one? How about issues, reports for future meetings, anything? Jed, Chris, anything?
Good for now, I gotta dream up something for my.
Okay. All right.
I promise you, you don't. I promise you.
Well, with that said, we stand adjourned. Thank you, Mark.